And we're podcasting. Herman Melville. The novel is called Pierre, or The Ambiguities. And by the way, sometimes you just want to upload a video that's not in HD so that it doesn't take 3 hours to do it. So that's what you're looking at now. And I like to flip on the filters because they seem more interesting to me. So, okay. This is kind of an indulgent episode for me. It's like, I'm not sure that this is exactly the right thing for you to be doing, is reading Herman Melville's Pierre. But for as widely read and highly regarded as Herman Melville's Moby-Dick is, in the fast-burning embers of what was American culture, it's actually pretty shocking how seldom you hear anything about this follow-up novel written about a year later, Pierre. Let's get into it. Imagine you are a docile young man of good manners in line to inherit a significant country estate. Your father has passed away, and so you're very close with your mother, of course. You're about 20 years old, and you're courting young Lucy Tartan, a neighbor girl with blonde hair whom your mother believes will be a perfect match for you. Let's go a little farther and say you're so close to Mom that you really have no secrets from her. Until one day. Actually, you know what? 15 years ago or so, they could have made this movie perfectly, and it would have fit right in with those fin de siècle, like The Matrix and Pleasantville and Truman Show, all those movies, Fight Club, that were about like sort of illusion and people waking up. It would have starred younger Joaquin Phoenix as Pierre and 1997 Reese Witherspoon as Lucy Tartan. Probably Meryl Streep as Pierre's doting and overprotective mother. And then one day, Pierre is asked by his mother to accompany her to a charitable event arranged by two middle-aged spinstresses, at which 40 young ladies would be sewing new threads for the destitute and newly arrived immigrants. It is evening when they go, and so the sewing room is candle lit. Picture this. When Pierre and his mother are announced, like they used to do, announced, because one day Pierre will be the lord of the manor of all these girls. And when he's announced, there is a shriek. He doesn't see where the sound originates, but it cuts into his heart. He is momentarily staggered, but he's reassured. Someone tells him, "It's okay, someone has only fainted. Carry on." His mother leaves him alone to go gossip, and soon he's gazing on the 40 faces when, instead of blushing, the color runs out of his cheeks. He sees a face unlike any he has seen before. In the movie, of course, it is the face of younger Helena Bonham Carter, and though at first her eyes are darting, eventually she locks eyes with his. And so we get this quote from the book. A wild, bewildering, and incomprehensible curiosity had seized him to know something definite of that face. A brunette. Surely Pierre wants a closer look, wants to know, dare we acknowledge, how the hair smells, feels between his fingers, and so on. I mean, what a scene. Now imagine you're this Pierre, and your mother asks you on the way home in the carriage, "Why are you being so withdrawn? Why do you look so pallid? What was it you saw there?" And for the first time in your life, you retain a secret from Mom and tell her nothing. It was just a, rush of blood or something. Now, the blonde Lucy Tartan can't wait to see you the next day, but you cannot forget the face. The face! Listen to this description of this part of the novel as an example of what I mean by interiority and as an example of the psychological novel, the kind that certainly anticipates Dostoevsky and even Proust. Quote, What inscrutable thing was it that so suddenly had seized him and made him a falsifier, aye, a falsifier and nothing less, to his own dearly beloved and confiding mother? Here indeed was something strange for him. Here was stuff for his utmost ethical meditations, but nevertheless, on strict introspection, he felt that he would not willingly have it otherwise. Not willingly would he now undissemble himself in this matter to his mother. Why was this, too? What was this his want? Here again was food for mysticism. Here, in imperfect inklings, tingling presentiments, Pierre began to feel what all mature men who are Magians sooner or later know, and more or less assuredly, that not always in our actions are we our own factors. But this conceit was very dim in Pierre, and dimness is ever suspicious and repugnant to us, and so Pierre shrank abhorrently from the infernal catacombs of thought, down into which this fetal fancy beckoned him. Only this, though in secret, did he cherish, only this he felt persuaded of, namely, that for both worlds would he, namely, that not for both worlds would he have his mother made a partner to this sometime mystic mood. Holy freaking crap, right? I mean, you can get a full undergraduate degree in psychology in 2021 from whatever university you want, and it won't contain that much insight into human nature, as that paragraph suggests. And the important point of it is this, at least in my experience, this really is what it's like to be a young man really falling in love with a woman your dear mother wouldn't understand. Now, imagine a day passes in the novel, in the movie. An uneventful day, a distracted day, lunch with the local minister, and then a ride in the carriage with, what's her name? Oh yeah, Lucy Tartan. A whole day spent thinking about the face, and then, unexpectedly, a letter arrives, delivered by a stranger, by hand. Consider here what a novel can do that even a movie cannot do. In the movie, of course, it's just the guy getting the novel, and maybe they zoom in on his face or something. But the novel gives us the full inner experience of receiving an unexpected letter when you normally wouldn't, even as you find yourself obsessing over the presence of a new-come stranger's face. Listen, quote, Pierre now seemed distinctly to feel two antagonistic agencies within him, one of which was just struggling into his consciousness, and each of which was striving for the mastery, and between whose respective final ascendancies he thought he could perceive, though shadowly, that he himself was to be the only umpire. One bade him finish the self-destruction of the note, for in some dark way the reading of it would irretrievably entangle his fate. The other bade him dismiss all misgivings, not because there was no possible ground for them, but because to dismiss them was really the manlier part, never mind what might betide. This good angel seemed mildly to say, "Read, Pierre, though by reading thou mayest entangle thyself, yet mayest thou thereby disentangle others. Read, and feel the best blessedness which, with the sense of all duties discharged, holds happiness indifferent." The bad angel insinuatingly breathed, "Read it not, dearest Pierre, but destroy it, and be happy." Then, at the blast of his noble heart, the bad angel shrunk up into nothingness, and the good one defined itself clearer and more clear, and came nigher and more nigh unto him, smiling sadly but benignantly, while forth from the infinite distances wonderful harmonies stole into his heart, so that every vein in him pulsed to some heavenly swell. Wow. Do you begin to understand now why we read novels and why I'm trying so hard to explain that we need to have a vision more expansive than the most woke or most red-pilled politics? See, life is almost infinitely more complex. Human beings are infinite wells of meaning, and what a tragedy it would be to turn them into servants or, like cogs in some political machinery. And guess what the letter says? It says, Pierre, thou art not the only child of thy father. Isabel calls thee her brother. What? Yes, the face speaks. And it's his sister? What? Shit. And this is all merely the setup for the much more entangled psychological drama that occurs in this story. But now, notice how the structure of this mental conflict is working. Again, I know that's hard to listen to, but if you read it, what it said, the paragraph I just read, should Pierre have simply torn up the note, averted his eyes, chosen ignorance, happiness would have been his, assuredly. He was to inherit his father's estate with his mother's support. He was to marry Lucy Tartan. Life was plotted out for him, and it would have been a life of social approval and reasonably high status. But Pierre is a youth, and a noble one, a romantic one, a Byronic one. This sort of youth sets one thing even higher than social approval, and that is the truth. Read, and risk ruining your life as far as social status goes. Or don't read and be happy. Pierre, I think like Melville, reads. And what he finds there, he finds to be extremely inconvenient. And yet, as if he has taken a vow, he must serve his truth ahead of any competing concerns. And so Pierre hatches a plan. He tells his mother out of the blue that he is married, and not to Lucy Tartan. Mother is horrified, of course. And by the way, this seems to be part of like the modern retake on the Gilgamesh quest. You don't serve truth without horrifying mommy a little bit along the way, gentlemen. He runs away with Isabel, his sister, whose father, she says, threw her out as an orphan. She is destitute, and he decides he owes it to her to look after her. And perhaps it doesn't hurt that she's an absolute stunner of a femme fatale. The narrator goes on and on about how Pierre was staggered by what he read in the letter, and then says, listen to this. Pierre staggeringly rose to his feet, his wide eyes fixed, and his whole form in a tremble. Myself am left, at least, he slowly and half-chokingly murmured. With myself I front thee. Unhand me all fears, and unlock me all spells. Henceforth I will know nothing but truth, glad truth or sad truth. I will know what is, and do what my deepest angel dictates. And viewer, I tell you, I read this when I was 24 years old, and I never forgot it. Pierre now returns to his room and looks again at the covered portrait of his father. And now it appears changed. His father's half-smile is now a lecherous smirk. His father was no hero, no nobleman, but a rake. So Pierre destroys the portrait. Pierre is now set adrift. Eventually, Pierre and Isabel meet up with some kind of crazy, destitute girl named Deli, whom Isabel wants to help, and so Pierre is now helping both of them. But he has no meaningful prospects for making money. Again, the narrator serves up some absolutely golden, like Iliad-style similes to describe these psychological states, like what it's like to be trying to do the right thing, but to not have any money, to have given up your, high status position in order to do the right thing, and so on. Quote, "Now, from his height of composure, he firmly gazed abroad upon the charred landscape within him, as the timberman of Canada, forced to fly from the conflagration of his forests, comes back again when the fires have waned, and unblinkingly eyes the immeasurable fields of firebrands that here and there glow beneath the wide canopy of smoke." Man. So if this, you may not pick it up just listening to this, but this is a proper religious conversion experience, and if it's not, it's something like that gone sideways, gone wrong. I read a book one time by Kay Redfield Jameson about mania, and she pinpointed Melville as one who would have been diagnosed as manic, if he had been around in the 20th century. I very much agree. And there's evidence of that in the narrator's description of Pierre here. Listen, quote, "If it be the sacred province, and by the wisest deemed, the inestimable compensation of the heavier woes, that they both purge the soul of gay-hearted errors and replenish it with a saddened truth, that holy office is not so much accomplished by any covertly inductive reasoning process, whose original motive is received from the particular affliction, as it is the magical effect of the admission into man's inmost spirit of a before unexperienced and wholly inexplicable element, which, like electricity, suddenly received into any sultry atmosphere of the dark in all directions, splits itself into nimble lances of purifying light. In these flashing revelations of grief's wonderful fire, we see all things as they are, and though, when the electric element is gone, the shadows once more descend, and the false outlines of objects again return, yet not with their former power to deceive." Do you see what I mean here about the psychological novel? This is not a description of trivial fictional events occurring. Instead, it is an exploration of certain non-ordinary states of consciousness. This is the best description I've ever read of what it feels like to, get red-pilled or wake up. This struggle between the will to truth and the obligatory pro-sociality that's sort of expected of us is one of the central themes of this book. And it shows you what your harvest will be if you decide to follow truth rather than to cater to the opinions of the masses. Quote, "Such, O thou Son of Man, are the perils and the miseries thou callest down on thee, when, even in a virtuous cause, thou steppest aside from those arbitrary lines of conduct by which the common world, however base and dastardly, surround thee for thy worldly good." Melville knew the secret, okay? Now, was he a Straussian? I ask because I have a few subscribers who are really into Strauss, apparently, one or two who are in the cult, and a few more who like to see Straussians BTFO'd whenever the opportunity arises. And because I read Persecution and the Art of Writing the other day, where the ostensible theme, that is, at least at the superficial level, is that the great writers saw that the world around them was corrupt and false, and yet, wanting to write the truth, nevertheless, they figured out ways to write cryptically, often burying their true idea beneath a mountain of platitudinous drivel meant to satisfy the ruling regime and its censors. Is something like this going on in Pierre, or in Melville's work in general? Well, maybe vaguely. It's true that Melville pleased his readers with his first two novels, Typee and Omoo, and then alienated them badly with Mardi, and then with Moby-Dick. And he says he was writing Pierre in need of money and that he was, reading a lot of negative reviews of Moby-Dick at the time. His publisher wasn't high on printing Pierre for that reason, but, Melville promised that it would be a story written for a female readership. that it was eminently readable, and it centered on a typical love triangle story. It couldn't miss. This one would sell, you know. But then, of course, it was not well received because there are consistent, barely concealed themes of radical dissent, truth-seeking in the face of social disapprobation, incest, murder, and so on. And thus the famous title of the most scathing of the reviews of Pierre, Herman Melville Crazy. But nevertheless, I think it's wrong to call this Straussian. What is being concealed in Strauss is some sort of political idea. In Melville, the controversial stuff is closer to what the mainstream public would think of as schizophrenic, and what I, being less or more than mainstream, refer to as mystical. That is to say, Melville's interest is in states of mind that are more or less taboo. Consider this excerpt from a 2008 article published in the Journal of Mental Health, Religion, and Culture by Charles P. Harriet Maitland. Quote, "We should not be attempting to eliminate the anomalous experience. The experience happens for a reason. It is a universal law of nature, and if we try to stop it, we would only be leaving additional problems unresolved. Rather than channeling all our efforts toward preventing these experiences, as is the focus of most drug therapy, we should instead be looking to nurture them so that they can be appraised and utilized in a valuing way." This kind of thing is still taboo, maybe no more now, or maybe even more now than it was in 1852. And the idea of serving something you call truth before and ahead of even social approval will still get you in trouble, just as it did for Pierre. From the countryside, Pierre takes Isabel and Deli into New York City, where they move into a sort of artist commune in a 7-story building where Pierre decides to become a great writer. Not the popular kind, mind you, but the kind who tells the truth, of course. It is freezing, and he writes all day long, day after day, as his hands shake, and the women he's supposed to be supporting, taking care of, waste away. Eventually, then, the third woman, Lucy Tartan, even moves in with him. Pierre is no longer an innocent. Now he is confronted with all the diversity of the cosmopolitan city. Quote, "Indescribable disorder, frantic, diseased-looking men and women of all colors, and in all imaginable flaunting, immodest, grotesque, and shattered dresses were leaping, yelling, and cursing around him." The carnival atmosphere, the cosmopolitan atmosphere, commenting on Pierre's frenzied efforts to give the world a book, Melville asks whether all of Pierre's effort expended in composing a book that must undoubtedly go to the worms has been in vain. And then the narrator replies to his own question, "Not so. That which now absorbs the time and the life of Pierre is not the book, but the primitive elementalizing of the strange stuff, which in the act of attempting that book has upheaved and upgushed in his soul. 2 books are being writ, of which the world shall only see one, and that the bungled one. The larger book, and the infinitely better, is for Pierre's own private shelf. That it is, whose unfathomable cravings drink his blood. The other only demands his ink." This is really amazing stuff. Watch it again later for 0.75x speed if you're really into it, and if you're an artist especially. And if you feel torn between trying to do the art you want to do and trying to sell it. Anyway, as he's going to the city, he comes across a pamphlet by one Plotinus Plinlimmon. This pamphlet is presented as a fragment in the middle of the book, and it seems to me to capture the problem of the ambiguities of the title. And so if you feel up to it, listen now and watch as I read it to you. Plotinus Plinlimmon, in 333 lectures. Lecture first, chronometricals and horologicals, being not so much the portal as part of the temporary scaffold to the portal of this new philosophy. Few of us doubt, gentlemen, that human life on this earth is but a state of probation, which among other things implies that here below we mortals have only to do with things provisional. Accordingly, I hold that all our so-called wisdom is likewise but provisional. This preamble laid down, I begin. It seems to me in my visions that there is a certain most rare order of human souls, which, if carefully carried in the body, will almost always and everywhere give heaven's own truth, with some small grains of variance. For peculiarly coming from God, the sole source of that heavenly truth, and the great Greenwich Hill and Tower from which the universal meridians are far out into infinity reckoned, such souls seem as London sea chronometers, Greek time-namers, which, as the London ship floats past Greenwich down the Thames, are accurately adjusted by Greenwich time, and if heedfully kept, will still give the same time, even though carried to the Azores. True, in nearly all cases of long, remote voyages, to China, say, chronometers of the best make, and the most carefully treated, will gradually more or less vary from Greenwich time, without the possibility of the error being corrected by direct comparison with their great standard. But skillful and devout observations of the stars by the sextant will serve materially to lessen such errors. And besides, there is such a thing as rating a chronometer. That is, having ascertained its degree of organic inaccuracy, however small, then in all subsequent chronometrical calculations, that ascertained loss or gain can be readily added or deducted as the case may be. Then again, on these long voyages, the chronometer may be corrected by comparing it with the chronometer of some other ship at sea more recently from home. Now, in an artificial world like ours, the soul of man is further removed from its God and the heavenly truth than the chronometer carried to China is from Greenwich, and as that chronometer, if at all accurate, will pronounce it to be 12 o'clock high noon, when the China local watches say perhaps it is 12 o'clock midnight, so the chronometrical soul, if in this world true to its great Greenwich in the other, will always, in its so-called intuitions of right and wrong, be contradicting the mere local standards and watchmakers' brains of this earth. Bacon's brains were mere watchmakers' brains, but Christ was a chronometer, and the most exquisitely adjusted and exact one, and the least affected by all terrestrial jarrings of any that have ever come to us. And the reason why his teachings seemed folly to the Jews was because he carried that heaven's time in Jerusalem, while the Jews carried Jerusalem time there. Did he not expressly say, "My wisdom," time, "is not of this world"? But whatever is really peculiar in the wisdom of Christ seems precisely the same folly today as it did 1850 years ago, because in all that interval his bequeathed chronometer has still preserved its original heaven's time, and the general Jerusalem of this world has likewise carefully preserved its own. But though the chronometer carried from Greenwich to China should truly exhibit in China what the time may be at Greenwich at any moment, yet, though thereby it must necessarily contradict China time, it does by no means thence follow that with respect to China, the China watches are at all out of the way. Precisely the reverse, for the fact of that variance is a presumption that with respect to China, the Chinese watches must be all right, and consequently, as the China watches are right as to China, so the Greenwich chronometers must be wrong as to China. Besides, of what use to the Chinaman would a Greenwich chronometer keeping Greenwich time be? Were he thereby to regulate his daily actions, he would be guilty of all manner of absurdities, going to bed at noon, say, when his neighbors would be sitting down to dinner. And thus, though the earthly wisdom of man be heavenly folly to God, so also, conversely, is heavenly wisdom of God an earthly folly to man. Literally speaking, this is so. Nor does the god at the heavenly Greenwich expect common men to keep Greenwich wisdom in this remote Chinese world of ours, because such a thing were unprofitable for them here, and indeed a falsification of himself, inasmuch as in that case China time would be identical with Greenwich time, which would make Greenwich time wrong. But why then does God now and then send a heavenly chronometer as a meteoric stone into the world, uselessly, as it would seem, to give the lie to all the world's timekeepers? Because he is unwilling to leave man without some occasional testimony to this, that though man's Chinese notion of things may answer well enough here, they are by no means universally applicable, and that the central Greenwich in which he dwells goes by a somewhat different method from this world. And yet it follows not from this that God's truth is one thing and man's truth another, but, as hinted above, and as will be further elucidated in subsequent lectures, by their very contradictions they are made to correspond. By inference it follows also that he who, finding in himself a chronometrical soul, seeks practically to force that heavenly time upon the earth, in such an attempt he can never succeed, with an absolute and essential success. And as for himself, if he seek to regulate his own daily conduct by it, he will but array all men's earthly timekeepers against him, and thereby work himself woe and death. Both these things are plainly evinced in the character and fate of Christ, and the past and present condition of the religion he taught. But here one thing is to be especially observed. Though Christ encountered woe in both the precept and the practice of his chronometricals, yet did he remain throughout entirely without folly or sin, whereas almost invariably with inferior beings, the absolute effort to live in this world according to the strict letter of the chronometricals is, somehow, apt to involve those inferior beings eventually in strange, unique follies and sins unimagined before. It is the story of the Ephesian matron allegorized. To any earnest man of insight, a faithful contemplation of these ideas concerning chronometricals and horologicals will serve to render provisionally far less dark some few of the otherwise obscurest things which have hitherto tormented the honest-thinking men of all ages. What man who carries a heavenly soul in him has not groaned to perceive that unless he committed a sort of suicide as to the practical things of this world, he never can hope to regulate his earthly conduct by that same heavenly soul? And yet, by an infallible instinct, he knows that that monitor cannot be wrong in itself. And where is the earnest and righteous philosopher, gentlemen, who, looking right and left and up and down through all the ages of the world, the present included, where is there such a one who has not 1,000 times been struck with a sort of infidel idea, that whatever other worlds God may be the Lord of, he is not the Lord of this, for else this world would seem to give the lie to him, so utterly repugnant seem its ways to the instinctively known ways of heaven. But it is not and cannot be so, nor will he who regards this chronometrical conceit aright ever more be conscious of that horrible idea, for he will then see, or seem to see, that this world's seeming incompatibility with God absolutely results from its meridional correspondence with him. This chronometrical conceit does by no means involve the justification of all the acts which wicked men may perform. For in their wickedness, downright wicked men sin as much against their own horologs as against the heavenly chronometer. That this is so, their spontaneous liability to remorse does plainly evince. No, this conceit merely goes to show that for the mass of men, the highest abstract heavenly righteousness is not only impossible, but would be entirely out of place and positively wrong in a world like this. To turn the left cheek if the right be smitten is chronometrical. Hence, no average son of man ever did such a thing. To give all that thou hast to the poor, this too is chronometrical. Hence, no average son of man ever did such a thing. Nevertheless, if a man gives with a certain self-considerate generosity to the poor, abstains from doing downright ill to any man, does his convenient best in a general way to do good to his whole race, takes watchful, loving care of his wife and children, relatives and friends, is perfectly tolerant to all other men's opinions, whatever they may be, is an honest dealer, an honest citizen, and all that, and more especially if he believe that there is a God for infidels as well as for believers, and acts upon that belief, then, though such a man falls infinitely short of the chronometrical standard, though all his actions are entirely horologic, yet such a man need never lastingly despond, because he is sometimes guilty of some minor offense. Hasty words, impulsively returning a blow, fits of domestic petulance, selfish enjoyment of a glass of wine while he knows there are those around him who lack a loaf of bread. I say he need never lastingly despond on account of his perpetual liability to these things, because not to do them and their like would be to be an angel, a chronometer, whereas he is a man and a horologe. Yet does the horologe itself teach that all liabilities to these things should be checked as much as possible, though it is certain they can never be utterly eradicated. They are only to be checked, then, because if entirely unrestrained, they would finally run into utter selfishness and human demonism, which, as before hinted, are not by any means justified by the horologe. In short, this chronometrical and horological conceit in some seems to teach this, that in things terrestrial, that is, horological, a man must not be governed by ideas celestial, that is, chronometrical. That certain minor self-renunciations in this life his own mere instinct for his own everyday general well-being will teach him to make, but he must by no means make a complete unconditional sacrifice of himself in behalf of any other being, or any cause, or any conceit. For does aught else completely and unconditionally sacrifice itself for him? God's own sun does not abate one tittle of its heat in July, however you swoon with that heat in the sun. And if it did abate its heat on your behalf, then the wheat and the rye would not ripen, and so, for the incidental benefit of one, a whole population would suffer. A virtuous expediency, then, seems the highest desirable or attainable earthly excellence for the mass of men, and is the only earthly excellence that their Creator intended for them. When they go to heaven, it will be quite another thing. There, they can freely turn the left cheek, because there the right cheek will never be smitten. There, they can freely give all to the poor, for there will be no poor to give to. A due appreciation of this matter will do good to man. For, hitherto, being authoritatively taught by his dogmatical teachers that he must, while on earth, aim at heaven, and attain it too, in all his earthly acts, on pain of eternal wrath, and finding by experience that this is utterly impossible, in his despair he is too apt to run clean away into all manner of moral abandonment, self-deceit, and hypocrisy, cloaked, however, mostly under an aspect of the most respectable devotion. Or else he openly runs like a mad dog into atheism. Whereas, let men be taught those chronometricals and horologicals, and while still retaining every common sense incentive to whatever of virtue be practicable and desirable, and having these incentives strengthened too by the consciousness of powers to attain their mark, then there would be an end to that fatal despair of becoming all good, which has too often proved the vice-producing result in many minds of the undiluted chronometrical doctrines hitherto taught to mankind. But if any man say that such a doctrine as if any man say that such a doctrine as this I lay down is false, is impious, I would charitably refer that man to the history of Christendom for the last 1800 years, and ask him whether, in spite of all the maxims of Christ, that history is not just as full of blood, violence, wrong, and iniquity of every kind as any previous portion of the world's story. Therefore it follows that so far as practical results are concerned, regarded in a purely earthly light, the only great original moral doctrine of Christianity, i.e., the chronometrical, gratuitous return of good for evil, as distinguished from the horological forgiveness of injuries taught by some of the pagan philosophers, has been found, horologically, a false one, because after 1800 years' inculcation from tens of thousands of pulpits, it has proved entirely impracticable. I but lay down then what the best mortal men do daily practice, and what all really wicked men are very far removed from. I present consolation to the earnest man, who, among all his human frailties, is still agonizingly conscious of the beauty of chronometrical excellence. I hold up a practicable virtue to the vicious, and interfere not with the eternal truth, that sooner or later, in all cases, downright vice is downright woe. Moreover, if... But here the pamphlet was torn, and came to a most untidy termination. Wow. So, look, if we're being honest, and I mean like really honest, it's not very cut and dry, right? I watched a good Paul Talk video the other day recently where he's complaining again about the Heideggerian trap. And although I don't understand what Heidegger has to do with it, I take Paul's point that ultimately politics is sort of dodging or neglecting the larger problem, which is culture. Where is culture generated? Where is it born? Does it come from biology or from religious commitments or from legal frameworks? What about the influence of literature and the arts, which would include TV and Hollywood over the past 100 years? We're talking red pills on top of red pills here. Like, okay, yes, there's a usurious cabal running the media, but at most, that's only a statement of what isn't true and good and beautiful. If we did manage to wipe it away, what would we make? How would we write? What would we worship? And finally, is this a logos-driven book? Do I recommend it? The truth is, I'm not sure. If you read about the via negativa and that sounds plausible to you, or if you read the Wikipedia page for neti, and you see that as a legitimate path, if Pseudo-Dionysius seems like a true prophet to you, then yeah, maybe. I'm going to end on one of my favorite scenes in the book. Pierre, torn in a dozen different directions, contemplating his fate and thinking about what he ought to do, goes out for a walk in the woods. He approaches an old stony outcropping, one of his favorite places from childhood. There, he comes upon a giant stone that sort of balances on a single point at the bottom, and, quote, contemplating its ponderous inscrutableness, and referring to it as terror stone, Pierre threw himself prone upon the wood's last year's leaves and slid himself straight into that horrible interspace and lay there as dead. He is underneath the stone now, thinking unspeakable thoughts. At last he speaks, and this is from the novel, quote, "If the miseries of the undisclosable things in me shall ever unhorse me from my manhood's seat, if to vow myself all virtues and all truths be but to make a trembling, distrusted slave of me, if life is to prove a burden I cannot bear without ignominious cringing, if indeed our actions are all foreordained, and we are Russian serfs to fate, if invisible devils to titter at us when we most nobly strive, if life be a cheating dream, and virtue as unmeaning and unequaled with any blessing as the midnight mirth of wine, if by sacrificing myself for duty's sake, my own mother re-sacrifices me, if duty's self be but a bugbear, and all things are allowable and unpunishable to man, then do thou, mute massiveness, fall on me. Ages thou hast waited, and if these things be thus, then wait no more, for whom better canst thou crush than him who now lies here invoking thee?" End quote. Well, would the Creator God who made all things encourage you to read such fiction? And to what end, other than to teach you how to think such dark thoughts? If I knew, viewer, I think I would tell you. But as Melville says, silence is the only voice of our God.